Hello and welcome to Marketing and Consumer Behaviour, Involvement and Perceived Risk. In this tutorial, we're going to understand the connection between involvement and risk, identify the different types of risk in purchase, and analyse how to manage the risks from a marketing perspective. Now, in our last tutorial, it became very clear that there were a large number of influences on consumer behaviour, and I'd like to recap some of the key theories. So there were a lot of influences from cultural to social to environmental, from personal to psychological. And we also discussed as a marketing manager, you need to know what they are and how to influence them. We also looked at the fact that there are a large number of influences on business buyer behaviour, with the most important being environmental influences. But don't forget that interpersonal and individual do play a large part, because at the end of the day, people are people within the decision-making unit, and obviously personality and culture is going to affect the buying process. We also discussed that there were 5 stages of the buyer decision process for consumers. Now remember, as a marketer, you need to influence these stages. And remember too, that consumers will not always move logically through those 5 stages. They may go backwards and forwards, and you need to be prepared for that. We also discussed that the buy grid framework, when businesses are making a purchase, are a lot more complex. There tends to be a lot more stages, it's going to involve suppliers, and it's more than likely going to be over a much longer period of time. When it comes to consumer buying, there are consumer buying roles, from the initiator to the influencer, the decider, and the buyer. Do you know who they are as a marketer, and what key messages are you going to communicate to each person in the consumer buying process? We also looked at the more complex roles within the decision-making unit, and the fact that there could be as many as 20 people within this process, or within a large company there might only be 2 or 3. But buying behaviour is complex, and it really depends on a number of factors. So some of the things that you should be thinking about: is your product or service high involvement or low involvement? Now, it's going to be high involvement if it's fairly expensive, if it's quite complex to understand, if there are a lot of competitors in the marketplace, which means that your consumer or your customer needs to wade through quite a lot of information to decide whether or not to buy your product or your service. It's going to be low involvement if your product is a commodity product. It's fairly cheap to buy. There's not a lot of risk in buying it. If it doesn't work out, it's not a huge problem for the organisation or the consumer. They can return it, or they can use it in some other way. Services do tend to be much more high involvement than products, and the reason for this is that you cannot try them before you buy them. Quite often, you can only consume a service at the same time as you're purchasing it. Or if you think about a driving lesson, it's very difficult to know what that's going to be like unless you actually consume it. It's the same thing for an educational course, the same thing for a holiday. So as a marketer, you need to think about, how am I going to take the risk out of the situation in purchasing, especially when the product is high involvement? And when I think about our courses, some of the things that we do is that we have student testimonials, or we might send students a sample, or they can watch lectures online, or they can read about on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, third-party reviews, so that it isn't just us or independent articles. So you need to think through as a marketer, how can I take the risk out of the situation? Because obviously the higher the involvement, the more risk there is. And obviously this follows on. If your product is high involvement, there's going to be a perceived high risk for the consumer or the business. If it's low involvement, such as a donut, it's going to be low risk. And if you're uninvolved, then you might want to consider a lot of brands in the mix. It's not an emotional decision in any way. There's a lot of types of risk, and we've named a couple here. One is functional risk, where the consumer is worried that the product may not perform at the necessary standards that the customer is claiming. And that's certainly true for a car or a printer or any product that you might buy. There might be a financial risk, the concern that you're actually paying a higher price than necessary. Maybe there's a risk of effort and time. There's also a psychological risk that people think you're stupid for buying the product or investing it, or your friends say, oh, we don't really think that that's worth the money, or you might look silly using it in some way. So psychological risk is something that needs to be overcome. So how do you actually manage the process? Well, as a marketer, you need to think through about how you're going to manage risk. And here are some strategies here. Reassurance messages. And those reassurance messages need to be before they buy, during the purchase, and after they've bought it, to reassure them that they have made the right decision. You also need to recognise that your product or service is high involvement or low involvement, and that means taking longer over the purchasing decision, making sure that your messages are tailored accordingly and that customers can get information through various points, whether it be online, whether it be through the telephone, whether it be talking to you directly. I notice this with students. Some students are very happy to purchase online, don't even need to speak to our organisation, and other students we spend considerable time with on the phone asking of a whole variety of questions. And as a business, you need to be that flexible because you are managing the risk process. Another thing in managing risk is the post-purchase process. Don't assume that the process ends when the customer has bought the product. You need to think through, do you have a helpline? Do you contact them after they've purchased the product to make sure that everything is okay, or does it need to be tweaked or changed or set up in any way? And that really leads through into a relationship marketing campaign, which means that you can continue to keep in touch with your customers to reassure them that they've made the right choice, to make sure that they recommend you. And also you might want to upgrade them or move them on to a more sophisticated product. That becomes easier once you've already managed the risk. So some of the learning checks for this week is, what is the connection between involvement and risk? What are the different types of risk in a purchase, and how can you manage risks from a marketing perspective? Thank you.